Hello, everybody. We are moving on to archaeology. Uh, yeah. So, let me see. Is there anything I need to talk about before we get started? Make sure that when you are looking at your reflections, the grades, make sure you're looking at the feedback as well. The feedback is where I'm going to tell you whether you got something wrong or right. A lot of times, you guys will have full credit, but there will still be things wrong within the reflection, and that will only be pointed out in the feedback. So make sure to check the notes. I'll leave like a message for you in the grade or whatever. So if you just because you see basically what I'm saying, just because you see 100% or an 8 does not mean that there's no feedback. Make sure to check the feedback that I give you in the reflection. Okay. All right. So archaeology. Um, you know, archaeology is largely about understanding our past. What are some of the obvious difficulties that arise in trying to investigate the past? Okay. So some practical problems, basically, we're going to talk about those, but I want you also think about when you're doing archaeology, you're investigating people that are not here anymore, right? So what are some of the challenges that come with that? And if you really think about the difference here, it is actually not very different um, from social culture anthropology, right? So social culture anthropology, which studies societies and cultures, it is the same thing, but the difference is for archaeology, since they aren't alive anymore, it's a very different process for, getting their information. Okay, so keep that in mind. All right. What do archaeologists do? Archaeologists analyze material traces of human activities. They look at modification of the physical environment by humans. They look at the archaeological record to interpret cultural diversity and change. And finally, they provide illumination on past forms of human culture that do not exist today. Right? So, what is the difference between human activities and modification of physical environment, or why do they have that there specifically? If you think about a lot of what humans do, we don't only make things, we also modify things. So, for example, I don't know how to, the Lascaux cave paintings, right? Those cave paintings, technically, we did not invent the cave. We didn't build the cave. The cave was already there, but we modified the cave. That would be an example of something that an archaeologist would study as well, right? So it's not just stuff that we invent or make, like pots and pans and stuff like that. It's also the things that we modify. Okay. Yeah. So remember though, when we're thinking about archaeology, a lot of people focus on the digging up of stuff from our past, which is absolutely true. It's a big part of archaeology, a very, very big part. But you also have to understand that the goal of an archaeologist is to recreate the culture from the past. Okay. That is the most key thing. Okay. So there are two kind of versions of archaeology. One is processo, the other one's post-processo. So cultural process that create their culture is processo, and interpretive archaeology is post-processo. So realistically, they kind of the second one is the only one we use, but it's important to go over both of them. So processo archaeology views archaeology as an objective empirical science. It uses mathematics to examine distribution of material remains over space and time and emphasizes human adaptations to different environments. So, it's pretty straightforward. But the thing here is that, let me give you an example. So if we were to talk about a group of people that live near a river, processual archaeology, basically archaeology of the past, would talk more about oh, this group of people, they lived here for this many years. All right, sorry, they lived here 50 feet away from the river, and because they're 50 feet away from the river, they needed to have houses that were, flood proof. That's why they raised the houses, and that's also why they know how to fish, right? That is a pretty reasonable interpretation, and it's very concerned about kind of the mathematical or the scientific relationship between their distance to the river and what their technology is like. Okay, which is great. It's not wrong. But post-processal, you also have to emphasize, understand that people are human, right? Human agency and the power of ideas and advancement studying past cultures is very important. This new form stresses symbolic and cognitive aspects of societies, and they examine things like power, domination, internal contradiction in the society from the archaeological record. So basically, what this is talking about is basically it adds a more human element, right? So in the past, people were always really concerned about maybe it's the type of people that were in it, but they were very, very focused on like, oh, there were so and so close to a river, and so they do this and that, or they are really close to a mountain and they do this and that, which is great. But we also have to understand that just because we are all human does not mean that we are going to deal with problems the same way. Just as, when we are faced with an issue, even in today's society, like having to make money, the way we go about it is very different individually, right? So it's the same thing here, right? Post-processor just keeps that in mind. There are a lot of important things that are that it factor into an old society's lifestyle, other than just like, hey, they knew how to fish because they're near a river, right? So that's kind of like the important part about this is that it examines not just kind of the hard science and hard math parts of things, but also the non like cultural or power or whatever, all these other extra things that comes with being human that might not be included with the previous analysis. That's all. So this is very important. The archaeological record, right? Artifacts, ecofacts, features, and sites. So artifacts, as you guys probably already kind of know what this is. Artifacts are portable, very important, portable objects made, used, or modified by hominins. Ecofacts are plant or animal remains that are byproducts of hominin activities. And finally, features are non-portable remnants of hominin activities, such as walls, ditches, or mounds. So, what was I going to say? Okay, artifacts, portable objects, right? So artifacts are kind of the most common thing that people refer to when they're talking about archaeological records, right? If you find a pot, a pan, a cup, a clothes, jewelry, yeah, and pretty much everything. It's an artifact, right? But remember, it's an object made or used or modified. Okay. Now, ecofacts are plant or animal remains that are byproducts of hominin activities. So remains, right? This is very important. If you, if if there was a deer that was killed by people and it was eaten by people, and the bones are left over and we find the bones, that's an eco fact. But you have to be very careful, because if we, for example, use those bones and made them into something like, like a necklace or something, that would then become an artifact because we made it. Does that make sense? So eco facts are basically byproducts of animals or plants that haven't been modified any further by humans, right? But of course, the reason why they're there is because of humans. Okay. Um, like the leftover bones of a cat, maybe it would even be a good example, right? We didn't the cat is obviously there because we are there, but we didn't do anything after the cat passed away. Okay. Now, this next one, features. Features are non-portal remnants of hominin activities such as walls, ditches, or mounds. This is going to be in the quiz. Okay, so um my favorite and best example of a feature, right? So a feature is something that's similar to an artifact, but it just cannot be moved, right? The examples they have there are great. Walls, ditches, or mounds, you just can't move them. They're just too difficult to move. Um, Other more easy examples are things like bridges, um, buildings, monuments, the pyramids, right, are good examples. Those are things that we study that cannot be moved, right? Now, an example that I think is perfect is something like a graveyard, right? Because technically speaking, if you had the technology, you could move a monument, right? Or you could move even a small pyramid if you really had the technology for that. However, when we're talking about a graveyard, right? Because the graveyard, you're burying people within the earth, within the dirt, you have to move the earth with everything. So the graveyard is actually a really good example because it's like integrated into something that cannot be moved, right? And so those are features, okay? Features are, again, non-portable remnants of hominin activities, right? Walls, ditches, mounds, right? And then the example that I believe is the best example is a graveyard, okay? Now, sites, geographic location with the remains of past activities. Sites is just exactly what it sounds like. It's just where you find the archaeological record. Okay. Now, this is also very important. Preservation. Organic versus inorganic remains, right? Was this thing alive or was it not alive? if it was alive, it will not last as long in the ground as something that was not alive. It's very straightforward, right? What lasts long, like what'll last longer, like in the ground? A bunch of like chicken bones or, a wooden spatula. Obviously the wooden spatula. Okay. Also the climate, right? Very cold, very dry, or wet climates. Okay, this includes let's see. A very cold place, Siberia is a great example. Siberia, because it's so cold, is known for having woolly mammoth remains all the time. Dry places that are like deserts, like the Gobi Desert, Arizona, Death Valley. That's a great place for it to preserve. Or the opposite, very wet climates, places like Florida, the Amazon rainforest. These are also good examples. So you'll be asking yourself, like, what the heck? Like these are like a lot of places. But yes, but guess what? There's a lot of places that are in between, right? So for example, New York, San Francisco, like they're not great places because yeah, it's humid, but it's not humid enough. You see what I'm saying? Okay. Um, that's important. Now, transformational processes have two things: cultural factors and natural factors. Cultural factors such as looting or construction. Looting is when someone steals stuff, and this might be a little more common with things like the pyramids, right? Where when archaeologists finds, for example, a tomb of someone that is a member of the royal family, like a pharaoh or something, then there's a lot of valuables in there. There's a lot of gold, a lot of jewels and stuff like that. And to be completely honest, the archaeologist doesn't really have the resources to have people protect it. So what ends up happening is like some rich billionaire hires some like ex-CIA guy to go in there and get it. And there's very little an archaeologist can do to stop them. Another thing is construction. For example, if there's a Walmart built on top of this archaeological record, it's probably not going to get built. I'm sorry, it's not probably not going to be found, the archaeological record, right? Because you have something happening already on top of it. Places like New York City is terrible, right? Even New York City was an ideal place climate-wise for things to happen, it would be terrible. It would be terrible because like there's just a lot of construction, there's things taking into the ground all the time. A lot of stuff like that always happens. There's actually if you look it up, there's actually a thing in Miami where this plot of land has some remains of the original peoples from that place. And basically the company's like, yo, dude, we really like lose a lot of money, so I don't want to stop building, right? So that's an example of construction. Okay, natural factors such as animal activities or catastrophes. Animal activity is very easy to explain. If you look at any animal that digs, you can easily destroy archaeological records, right? Gophers, even cats, dogs, moles, whatever, right? Whatever digs, whatever lives in the ground, they can easily destroy stuff from our past, as well as natural catastrophes. Okay, also very easy to understand: tsunamis, floods, earthquakes, whatever. Those are more dramatic things that can destroy the archaeological record. But there's also smaller things, right? So like the things I like to give is like a mudslide. Mudslides are very, very small. Like they're not a big deal, but guess what? It mixes up the archaeological records from maybe 500 years ago with the ones that are 200 years ago. Because it's shifting. All this stuff is shifting. And so when that happens, you end up not getting a clear idea of what or where those archaeological things are from. Very good. So the next thing is, how do archaeologists find sites, right? The first thing is interviews. You'd be surprised how much you can find out by talking to someone. There are certain people who live on the land that their ancestors are from. So some people might interview someone and be like, yeah, my grandma used, or my great 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 grandmother used to talk about playing near a river over there. And you're like, oh, there's a river over there. You investigate the area and then you can find something, right? Maps. When we talk about maps, we're not talking about Google Maps. We're talking about old style maps. Old style maps, because we didn't have Google Maps, actually had a lot of information on them aside from directions, right? It had kind of like what was there, what was available, who was living there, so that you were aware of what was going on. And those maps sometimes have clues as to where people were living before a certain time. And an archaeologist might check out that area because, it's indicated on the map that there was a group of people that lived here. Okay. The next one is surveying. Surveying includes pedestrian, aerial, and geophysical. Pedestrian is just literally walking up and down. Aerial is using a helicopter or a airplane, and geophysical is using like a we'll talk about it, like a sonar technology thing to detect things. I'll talk about that in a second. But pedestrian and aerial, they're pretty straightforward. The weakness of pedestrian is that you don't cover a lot of space. The advantage of pedestrian is that you can look up and down. I'm sorry, you can look at things in detail. So if I'm walking along the beach, I can see something sticking out of the ground, and I'd be like, yo, that might be something that's interesting. But if I was obviously in a plane, I wouldn't be able to do that. And that's moving on to the next one, aerial. The disadvantage is that you don't get to see things in detail, but the advantage is you can cover a like a lot of distance with your plane slash helicopter. The aerial technique is a little bit more for things like ruins of cities and stuff like that. So much bigger situations. While pedestrians are used for preliminary or like when you're trying to investigate something. Okay. Now the last one, geophysical, right? Geophysical is if you guys are familiar with sonar technology, like in submarines. So in submarines, what they do, they shoot out like a wave, a sound wave, and when it hits metal, it'll bounce back, right? And that's how you know that there's like or torpedoes or whatever coming at you. Now, that's kind of the same thing with the geophysical technology that they use to look for buried remains, right? It is this machine that goes to the ground, it shoots these waves out, and if it bounces back, that means something is there. Okay, that's how that works. Okay. Now, the last thing, which is a much newer thing, are geographic information systems, which is basically a Google Maps, but for archaeologists, right? And so they log it with all this information so that, when in the future, when other archaeologists look into it, they have something to go off of. All right. How to study sites. So excavation of a site consists of systemically uncovering and of archaeological remains through recovery removal of the matrix. Excavation is always destructive, right? So excavation is the process of digging stuff up. That's all it is, right? When archaeologists are carefully and systematically digging stuff up from the ground, that is excavation. Now, what's interesting about excavation is that no matter how careful you are, excavation is always going to be destructive. It is never going to be 100% safe, right? When I say destructive, I mean to the archaeological record. So you have to understand, right? When we're pulling things out of the ground, the whole reason why this thing is still around after whatever 500 years is because it was in the ground. So once you pull it out of the ground, you are pulling it into destructive elements that it would not have survived in otherwise. So yes, could you be very careful and could the destruction be at a minimal level? Absolutely. But it still is a little bit destructive no matter how careful you are. Okay, so keep that in mind. That is also why documentation must be careful and thorough. So basically what happens is when they dig something up, they take like a million photos, they take notes, they hurry up and talk about like the color and all this other stuff before they even start like brushing it off and everything. Because they don't know how long it's going to stay intact. Okay. Now, recording of a site includes a three-dimensional grid system and a stratigraphic excavation, right? So what this is basically saying is that when archaeologists do a dig, they have to do like this very, very intense record keeping model, if you will, like drawing like a blueprint almost of like how they dug and like where they did end up digging, how big it is. Yeah, it's pretty intense because they got to know exactly where it was. And finally, when they're actually doing the digging, they only dig like 2 or 3 centimeters at a time so that it's even all across the whole thing. Okay. All right, categorizing. So categorizing involves things called assemblages, right? So cataloging involves classifying object shape, material, and function. Assemblages are groups of artifacts and features from a particular time and place on a site. So this is pretty straightforward, right? So archaeological cultures are constructed by grouping similar assemblages from many sites. So basically, assemblage is a collection of a bunch of stuff. Like you find a pot, a pan, a cup, and you're like, okay, hey, you found this all in the same place. They're probably from the same time period. And then you put them all together, and you're like, hey, this represents people X from this time, right? This is great. However, a lot of times it may be mistakenly assumed to represent a real social group, meaning that this is not 100% foolproof. Just because you find all those three things together does not mean it's from the same people for a lot of reasons. Um, like for you know, like when we're talking about mudslides. So when something's buried in the ground, and let's say a people were there 300 years ago and they died, and other people were there 100 years ago and they died. Do you think that you're going to be able to tell that they're from different groups of people if all the stuff is together? I don't know. It's really tough, right? So when things are put together, it's very it's 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 really difficult to tell whether it's from the same people or not, or same time period. All right, so full circle. Archaeology is largely about understanding our past. What are some of the obvious difficulties that arise in trying to investigate the past? The biggest thing is preservation, right? So when we talk about preservation, preservation is the biggest thing because um just because something doesn't exist, sorry, just because we cannot find the archaeological record of something does not mean that that group of people or that thing did not exist. It just means that they were made out of things or they were in an area where it did not preserve well, right? So present like you know, people might think like, oh, there's no native tribes from like, you know, New York, San Francisco. There are, but I'm just saying. But is it that there's no native tribes, or is it that the weather wasn't ideal for the native tribes stuff to last in the ground, or was it that all the native tribe stuff was made out of organic matter and so it didn't last very long, right? So these are all considerations we have to keep within our analysis. Okay. Yeah, that's pretty much it. All right. So if you have any questions, please shoot me an email at raymond.fong@kfc.edu. Make sure to check your grades and all that stuff. Actually, I don't know. Maybe by this time, well, it doesn't matter. Just make sure to keep up to date with all the bright space stuff, and you'll be good to go. Okay. Email me if you have any questions, and I'll see you in the next lecture.